Hey, look at him, dragging that dusty suitcase across weeds like a lost wanderer. A man who once promised me the world, now reduced to moving into a broken mansion that can't even hold up its own roof. What a shame. What a pitiful ending for someone who thought he was different. The neighbors are watching, the cameras are rolling, and I can't help but laugh because this, right here, is what failure looks like. That was his ex-wife's voice. Sharp and cruel, slicing through the air like broken glass. Her laughter rose above the rusted gates that groaned open to swallow him whole. She slowed her car just enough to savor the moment, her sunglasses catching the last drop of daylight as her lips curved in triumph. A man she once called husband now looked like a beggar at the door of a ruin. She wanted the image burned into memory, him standing small beneath the cracked archway, the symbol of her escape. But the truth was not what it seemed. His name was David Cole. And while the world saw a defeated man dragging his life into ruins, what they didn't see was the storm beneath his silence. David wasn't just another discarded husband. He was a builder, a strategist, a fighter who had carried hardship on his shoulders long before anyone called him failure. He had walked through poverty, through fire, through nights where the only thing heavier than his dreams was his hunger. And every time life tried to break him, he rebuilt. David came from a modest family, the kind that knew how to stretch every dollar and still share laughter around a small table. His parents taught him early that nothing is given, everything is earned, and dignity is the only inheritance no one can steal. Those lessons carved themselves into his bones. He studied hard. He worked harder. And while his peers raced to flash their new cars, new watches, new vacations, David stayed in the background. Saving, planning, building. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he was always the one listening the closest, the one preparing for storms. His marriage had started with promised dreams shared, plans drawn on napkins, laughter echoing in late-night talks. But as years passed, the cracks widened. His wife craved applause, glamour, the glitter of being seen. David's quiet investments, his late nights of coding, his cautious patience looked like stagnation to her. She wanted the world now. He wanted to build it forever. She wanted champagne and flashbulbs. He wanted foundations and long-term security. Eventually, love soured into resentment, and resentment into contempt. By the time the papers were signed, she had convinced herself she had escaped smallness and traded it for greatness. So when she saw him dragging that suitcase into a decayed mansion, its roof sagging, its walls stained by time, she believed she had proof she was right. She laughed, certain she was watching his ending. But David was not finished. The air inside the mansion was heavy with dust and old dreams. The hallway smelled of mold, the staircase railing came loose in his hand, and the walls sighed with decay. To outsiders, it was a tomb. To David, it was memory. This was the house where his father's hands had patched walls, where his mother's humming had lived in the vents, where boyhood summers were stamped into the driveway. It was broken now, but not dead. Neither was he. That first night, he lay on the floor in his jacket, his hoodie folded for a pillow, staring at the fractured skylight above. The stars blinked through like shy witnesses. To the world, he was pathetic, a man sleeping in ruins. To David, it was a promise. From here, he would rebuild. The whispers started quick. Neighbors took pictures, posting captions that cut like knives. From riches to rags, divorce karma. Man loses it all. Pity poured in from old acquaintances disguised as sympathy, really just thinly veiled curiosity. His ex-wife filled her feed with glittering dinners and curated smiles, writing captions about choosing peace and finally breathing. To the outside world, she was glowing and he was fading. But David knew something no one else did. Beneath the silence, behind the dust, there was a truth too heavy to reveal. For years, he had been building something invisible. A system he designed late at night, a company he nurtured in shadows, a creation that moved money, data, and power. While she dismissed him as small, he had been preparing something enormous. And now, though the house crumbled around him, his plan was seconds away from rising. The next morning, David walked the property with a small notepad in hand. The grass was knee-high. Weeds had split the driveway into crooked teeth, and the once proud stone walls were cracked like a wounded soldier's armor. He jotted every flaw down with patience: roof rot, damp basement, buckled plaster. To anyone else, it looked hopeless. To him, it was a map of what needed to be healed. Contractors came one by one. The structural engineer shook his head, muttering that the bones were tired. The roofer clicked his tongue, pointing out tiles peeling like scabs. The plumber laughed in disbelief at the ancient pipes. They all warned him, "This place will eat you alive." But David only nodded. He wasn't afraid of slow work. He'd lived with slow progress his whole life. Meanwhile, humiliation became a daily rhythm. A neighbor posted a photo of him carrying lumber into the mansion with the caption, "From penthouse to outhouse." It spread faster than the dust inside his walls. At the grocery store, whispers followed him down the aisle. Old friends sent him texts dipped in false concern. "Hang in there, man. Sorry to see you like this." He ignored them all. Silence was his armor. His ex-wife, however, turned her life into a gallery of victory. Photos at high-end restaurants, selfies in front of boutiques, her hand adorned with new jewelry courtesy of her new boyfriend. Captions like, "Finally free to shine," or "Peace looks good on me." Each post felt like a deliberate stab, as though her laughter the day he moved in wasn't enough. But David never replied. Never defended himself online. He didn't need to. While she was curating illusions, he was building foundations. Every day he stripped wallpaper, hammered nails, carried debris to dumpsters. He worked alongside electricians and plumbers, learning their tools, their tricks, their curses. He ate meals standing up, wiped sweat with his sleeves, and fell asleep each night exhausted but alive. The house was transforming slowly, and so was he. Still, the loneliness weighed heavy. Nights echoed with silence too loud to ignore. Sometimes he would sit under the broken skylight, remembering his mother's humming in the vents, or his father's calloused hands guiding his small fingers on a hammer. He thought about the boy he had been in this house. The boy who believed every dream could be built if he just worked long enough. That boy had been bruised by life, but he wasn't gone. Winter arrived with storms that tested everything. Rain pressed its cold hand against the half-finished windows, wind moaned through gaps in the roof, and more than once he woke to water creeping across the floor. But instead of breaking, David learned endurance. He patched leaks in the dark, dragged buckets across hallways, and kept going. The house taught him resilience all over again. His ex-wife drove by once in a friend's car. She slowed at the gate, sipping coffee from a paper cup, and gave a pitying smile mixed with superiority. To her, he was still a man clinging to a sinking ship. To him, she was just another passerby. He nodded politely and went back to hauling lumber. He didn't owe her the inside of his mind, and he certainly didn't owe her his secret. Because what no one knew, what not even his closest allies understood, was that the humiliation he endured was temporary. For while he hammered nails by day, his phone buzzed quietly with emails that mattered more than any gossip. Negotiations were happening. Contracts were crawling towards signatures. A company he had built in silence was on the verge of a sale that would rewrite everything. The world saw him as a broken man trapped in a ruin. But beneath the dust, David was holding a secret worth $150 million. And when the deal closed, the same laughter that haunted him would choke in the throats of everyone who mocked. Spring crept in, washing the mansion in pale sunlight. The roofers finished their work, the plumbers tamed the old pipes, the electricians rewired the bones of the house. The mansion was still a skeleton, but it no longer bled. For the first time in years, it was alive. David planted basil by the south wall, just as his mother once had, a small symbol of hope rooted in soil that had seen better days. But while the house grew stronger, the world still saw only failure. His ex-wife's circle whispered that he was clinging to ruins because he couldn't afford anything else. Her friends smirked when his name came up at brunch, mocking the image of him dragging buckets through leaky halls. Even some of his relatives shook their heads in private, muttering that David had lost his way. He let them, because while they laughed, the storm inside him was gathering. One Tuesday morning, kneeling on the library floor to measure baseboards, his phone buzzed. A simple message from his attorney. "It's done." Another followed seconds later, with a number that made his chest tighten. 150 million. David leaned back on his heels, staring at the message as if it were carved into stone. He closed his eyes, drew a long breath, and let it settle inside him. Not triumph, not arrogance, just relief. Years of sleepless nights, quiet coding, endless patience, all crystallized into a number that could silence every doubt. But he didn't cheer. He didn't rush to post it online. He stood, brushed dust from his knees, and walked the perimeter of the mansion, laying his hand against the walls like he was thanking an old friend for holding on. The news leaked quietly at first. A paragraph buried in a business blog about an acquisition, a social media account connecting dots from an SEC filing. Then headlines started appearing. Tech firm acquired for 150 million, founder revealed as David Cole. The same people who had pitied him now scrambled to call. Phones rang. Invitations flooded in. People who had forgotten his number suddenly wanted to reconnect. And his ex-wife? She found out the way everyone else did through the grapevine of gossip dressed as journalism. A friend sent her the link with 3 shocked emojis. She read the headline once, then again, her hands trembling as she scrolled. The article spoke of his company in measured tones, about data pipelines and integration strategies, but her eyes fixed on the number 150 million. The man she mocked as a ruined wanderer was now richer than anyone in her circle could dream. She sat in silence, replaying the memory of him dragging that suitcase, her laughter sharp in the air. It burned in her throat now, bitter and hollow. She had told the world she left a sinking ship, but the truth was, she had abandoned a man on the edge of transformation. David, however, never gloated. He didn't send her messages, didn't post cryptic quotes online, didn't wave his victory like a flag. He simply kept working. The deal gave him freedom, but his focus stayed on the mansion. He poured resources into the repairs, ensuring every wall, every beam, every window held firm. He hired the best craftsmen, not to boast, but to honor the home that had carried his memories. Yet whispers shifted. Neighbors who once mocked now walked slower past his gates, their eyes curious, their voices softer. Old acquaintances reached out with forced cheer, pretending they had always believed in him. Even his ex-wife, swallowed by regret, appeared at the gate one afternoon. She stood there, hesitant, wearing a smile rehearsed in the mirror, dressed in a way that blended apology with pride. But David didn't rush to her. He didn't need to. Because now, the balance had shifted. The world had laughed at his ruins. Now, his silence was louder than their noise. Summer painted the hill in gold. The mansion, once mocked as a ruin, now stood reborn. The roof caught sunlight like a crown. The walls gleamed with fresh strength. The garden bloomed where weeds once choked the soil. Inside, chandeliers cast warm light across polished floors, and the echo that had once sounded like emptiness now rang with life. David decided to open the doors for one night. Not to brag, not to prove anyone wrong, but to honor the people who had helped rebuild what others called impossible. He sent invitations to the roofer who worked through storms, the plumber who tamed the ancient pipes, the electrician who carved new veins of power through the walls, the painter who cut perfect lines by hand, the structural engineer who gave him truth when it hurt. These were his allies, his soldiers in the fight against decay. The night of the gathering, the mansion wore its new life proudly. Laughter filled the hall, glasses clinked, stories of sweat and scars were shared like trophies. In the library, David placed a box of old photographs, the ones he had rescued from under the stairs. At the center, framed freshly, was a picture of his parents smiling as though they knew this moment would come. Guests stopped, admired, and nodded. They understood that this house was not just a building, it was legacy. And then she appeared. His ex-wife. She didn't storm in, she didn't flaunt. She slipped through the doorway, her presence pulling the air tight. Gone were the captions and glittering smiles. She stood quietly, her eyes scanning the chandeliers, the polished railings, the life she had dismissed. For a long moment, she didn't move. David saw her from across the hall. He walked toward her with calm, each step echoing against the polished wood. They met where he had once stood alone with a suitcase and a broken railing. She looked around, her practiced smile faltering. Words came, hesitant, trembling. "It's beautiful. You look well." "I didn't know." David only nodded. He didn't gloat, didn't remind her of the laughter at the gates, didn't wield his fortune like a blade. His silence was enough. Because sometimes the sharpest revenge is not revenge at all. It's rising so high that the laughter below can no longer reach you. As the night faded, the workers left with smiles, promising to return for dinners not as laborers, but as friends. David closed the doors, touched the frames of the house as he turned off the lights, and stood under the skylight in the library. Above him, stars glimmered. Below, the basil leaned toward the window, thriving. He breathed deep. For the first time in years, the mansion was whole, and so was he. And his ex-wife? She left quietly, her laughter silenced, her pride swallowed. She would carry the memory of mocking him at his lowest, only to watch him rise higher than she could imagine. Family, if you've ever been laughed at while carrying your own suitcase. If you've ever been mocked while stepping into your ruins, remember this. The laughter is not the ending. It's only the beginning of your rebuild. David's story is proof that humiliation is temporary, but resilience lasts forever. So listen, if this story touched you, smash that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, another David is dragging his suitcase through the weeds, and he needs to know the ruins are not the end. They are the beginning. And the day will come when the laughter fades, and his silence will roar louder than every voice that mocked him.